I'm Arnold Garber from Oak Park, Michigan. I'm a magistrate and a lawyer in Southfield, Michigan. 3 steaming days in the pits. After our medical exam, we were allowed a few hours of deep slumber on a gymnasium floor on filthy mattresses without covers or sheets. The experience was almost enjoyable, as it was the first time we were allowed the luxury of a prone position. We were processed, given uniforms at daybreak that same morning, and sent off to a barracks. My minimum medical exam indicated sugar in my urine. It was probably a mix-up. Errors like that are bound to happen when processing so many people in such a short time. Someone else may have contributed to my bottle, or they simply mislabeled the bottles or switched them. All understandable. Nevertheless, I was immediately segregated from the handful of Detroit friends with whom I had arrived and put into an HO, holdover, barracks for further testing with a few others from my group. We were labeled HOs and quartered with quite a few other guys from other groups. The deal was that I had to produce a sugar-free urine sample 3 days in a row in order to rejoin my group. On the other hand, if sugar continued to show up, there was a good chance I would be sent back home with a medical discharge. Either situation would have been acceptable to me, but the decision, one way or the other, couldn't have happened quickly enough. I was in the middle of the worst few days of my entire life. One of the unwritten credos of our military must go something like this: no rest allowed for recruits. In Latin, it would probably sound more like impressive and perhaps even a bit historical. Bright and early on the morning of my first day in uniform, after an uncomfortable sleep on another dirty mattress, we HOs were assigned to our first official jobs. Even though we were medical holdovers, we were still Navy property and subject to the whims and demands of our superiors. Although we were suspected of being medically inferior and maybe unfit for military duty, the armed forces believed supplying a simple urine sample once a day was not sufficient reason to lounge around all day doing nothing. So they forced us to do heavy manual labor under conditions that could have seriously impacted and compromised the rest of our lives. 15 of us were selected for a job that needed doing, and we waited standing at attention for a ride to our first Navy assignment. After about an hour later, tired and stiff from standing at attention in front of the HO barracks, our ride arrived. The truck had no seats in it, and a very bad smell preceded its arrival. As a plumber's son, I easily recognized the unmistakable odor of raw sewage. We were invited to hop on board the filthy dump truck for a ride to our job. It was a most unappealing invitation, and I was slow to accept. We were given the option of marching to the job site instead, and I readily accepted the offer along with most of the other guys. The march took the better part of an hour. To our horror, we finally arrived at the sewage disposal plant that serviced the base. We were each handed a shovel, and we were joined the others who had arrived an hour before us on the dung limo heap ride. Our job was to shovel partially dried raw human sewage from drying ponds into the same dump truck that had brought our advance party to the site. To the best of my knowledge, the fecal truck transported the fruits of our labor to a fertilizer plant, but I'm not sure. It was a back-breaking work, even though as a plumber's son and helper I was no stranger to a shovel. I probably found the physical exertion on that hot July day easier than the rest of the guys because of my experience. I really felt badly for the ones who had never had a shovel in their hands before. By the end of the day, we were all so tired, sore, and exhausted that no one, including myself, could imagine marching another 4+ miles back to our barracks. No one turned down the ride back home in the Dungmobile. The ride turned out to be an exercise challenging our ability to balance ourselves. The truck smelled extremely ripe. It had not been washed after it dumped its last load, and you can only imagine how unappealing it smelled and looked. There was no way that anyone wanted to sit down in that mess if there was nothing to hold on to keep from falling into it as the truck bounced back to our barracks. We tried limiting our contact with the sewage by using only the index fingers on each hand against the slippery side of the truck bed to steady ourselves, but that didn't work too well. We ended up holding on to each other in the middle of the truck away from its slimy walls to try to keep from falling into the sewage. Not all of us were successful, and there was plenty of cussing going on. Those of us who had to give a urine sample walked to the medical lab right off the truck amid gas from the personnel. I guess we didn't smell too good. Surprise on the second day seemed to arrive much too quickly, and we knew our shovels were waiting for us at the fecal pond. Grudgingly, we forced our aching bodies to climb up the sides of the truck and over, dropping down into the bed of the truck. Marching the 4 or 5 miles to the sewage plant was out of the question that morning. We were all hurt too much. I was still nursing bleeding sores on my hands from pulling weeds at the Detroit train station prior to boarding the troop train, and some of my fellow sailors had other problems. The previous day of shoveling done added to the pain and bloody mess. I was told that there were no excuses for not obeying orders, so I just did as I was told, knowing that my parents would have been mortified if they knew what was happening to their son. I realized there was precious little I or anyone else could do to change things. I was on my own and had to deal with the situation on my own terms. I wondered if any prisoner in any jail in our country could be treated so inhumanely. Despair, depression, and disillusionment of daily life had settled in rather harshly among us, and I knew I had to do something to brighten things up a little, at least for myself. So I tried to think of something to break the cycle of despair as we bumped along in the bed of the foul-smelling truck that we would soon be filling with defecation produced by our Navy friends living on the base. My mother's words were bouncing around in my head. The worst job can be fun if you get creative. I could not imagine how to get creative while shoveling shit in a dung pond, but I was determined to try. It was another steaming hot day in the pits, and the heat probably increased the volatility of the pond gases by a factor of 12. I immediately put my germ of a plan into action. I carefully removed the fecal matter in a pattern forming the letter B in the pond. I followed that with UD and snickered as my fellow shovelers admired my handwork. Soon each of us had engraved our names in the most unlikely medium, and the contest of who could get the most laughs evolved. Our eagerness to sculpt our messages resulted in filling the first truck of the day in record time. The guy in charge was a little upset at our play and issued strict and explicit orders that we were not to carve out our names in the excrement. For a full 5 minutes we complied. I then removed waste from the area in which I was working, leaving a big letter S still standing in the sunlight. My fellow idiot stick, shovel users, were greatly amused but wary because I had broken the rule about carving out letters. I pointed out that I had not broken the law and that I didn't carve out a letter, but instead had removed everything but a letter. The letter had been there all the time. I merely set it free by removing the material surrounding it. I think Michelangelo did much the same thing in marble that I did in craft. I figured that I had actually done was the complete opposite of what we were warned not to do. Fear of reprisals by my group were quickly diluted when I asked one simple question. If this is really against orders, what type of punishment could they possibly give us that could equal what we were already doing? I guess it made sense, and visions of reclining in a nice cool jail cell danced in our heads. We explained it that way to our boss a few hours later as he admired our giant S we had exposed in excrement. It was clearly visible from the air, and we were well on our way to adding, we are being held prisoners in a sewage plant, but happily we had run out of time and shit for the day. Our ride home in the poop limo was a happier one than the previous day. Our singing, however, was drowned out by the clanging, banging, and bumping of our beloved dump truck. Our third and final day was also one of triumph, even though we were unable to successfully complete our intended picture of Mickey Mouse in the last pond. We had met the enemy, and the enemy was ours. Those of us who were required to do so made our urine deposits at the end of each of the 3 required days. We were expecting to rejoin our various groups for boot camp training, except for one small detail. We had to wait and work 2 more days because our 4th day of Navy life happened to be on a Saturday. No one was working at the urine lab on weekends to give us our final test results. That meant we had to wait until Monday before hopefully getting our negative results. Sadness and desperation was ours once again, big time.